against these loud cries for nonprofits to sort of batten down the hatches and protect themselves from the COVID storm, the Human Trafficking Institute actually had its most impactful year ever in virtually every category. And that simply would not have been possible without the generous partnership of many colleagues and friends and supporters and justice partners. I know that a number of you are on this call, and on behalf of the entire HTI team and those we serve, I want to say thank you. So let me give you a quick roadmap for our time together. First, we are going to look at an overview of HTI's model, which I'll give. And then second, my colleague, Shannon will lead us through a Q&A, providing an exclusive look at our 2020 annual report. And then my colleague, Lindsay will provide a sneak peek at the upcoming release of our 2021 Federal Human Trafficking Report. And then I will close out our time together. So let me begin by sharing a brief overview of HTI's work. Why does HTI exist? What's the problem that we're trying to solve? Well, the core problem is that there are, by conservative estimates, about 25 million victims of human trafficking around the globe today. And some experts suggest that as many as 93% of those victims are in developing countries. In the last 20 years, we've seen this really remarkable social transformation. It's really unprecedented to see what's happened just in the last 20 years, where we've gone from a small handful of countries having anti-trafficking laws to now virtually every country in the world having an anti-trafficking law. So laws are no longer the problem that they used to be. And in addition, we've started to see governments having not just moral reasons for caring about enforcing those laws, but also self-interested reasons for caring about enforcing those laws, economic reasons for caring about enforcing those laws. The challenge has been that the enforcement of those laws requires specialized enforcement expertise. You actually have to have law enforcement, prosecutors, and victim specialists that have some specific skills that are required to be effective at enforcing human trafficking laws in those countries. And so what we decided to do at the Human Trafficking Institute was to scale a model that we saw be effective during my time at the Justice Department when I was a federal prosecutor there, prosecuting human trafficking cases, to developing countries that were serious about measurably decimating trafficking within their borders, but didn't have access to the model or specialized expertise to do so. And so we launched the Human Trafficking Institute. And the Human Trafficking Institute exists to decimate modern slavery at its source by empowering police and prosecutors to stop traffickers. Our core idea is that we can't stop trafficking without stopping traffickers. That is, it's a necessary condition to decimate trafficking that we stop traffickers. That doesn't mean that stopping traffickers will be the only intervention that's important, but it will be a necessary intervention that's important. And that together we can actually decimate trafficking by empowering justice systems to stop traffickers. And we use that term decimate very intentionally. You know, decimate literally means to cut by 10%. So it actually comes from the Latin decum, which means 10. And in ancient times, in ancient Rome, actually, they used to have a practice called decimation, which is actually quite brutal. But to deter army units from defecting, they said, look, if your unit defects and we catch you, we will decimate your unit, which meant that we would randomly execute 10% of the members of your unit. And because no one knew whether they would be among that 10%, it created actually widespread compliance. And now decimate has come to mean colloquially, not just a reduction of 10%, but such a devastating and universalizing impact that it's to reduce the number so drastically that it's just unsustainable to continue. And we actually think that's actually a really good picture of what it means in the trafficking context. That is, we don't actually have to stop all the traffickers. If we can create a critical mass of enforcement, then Other traffickers who are not yet having the law enforced against them, it changes their risk calculus. It changes the risk for them because they don't know if they're next. And so the cost of engaging in the crime goes up. And once the cost exceeds the benefit, it's no longer worth it for them to engage in the crime. And so if we actually don't think we can totally end trafficking. We think there will always be some level of trafficking, but we do think that it can be decimated. That is, we can hit that critical mass that will produce big drops in the prevalence of trafficking. And that's actually a game changer. If you can do that one country after another, you're going to see dramatic transformational increases in enforcement and in protection of victims. So how does this work? What does this actually look like? Well, our model essentially involves three core components. We partner with developing countries that have good anti-trafficking laws that are serious about improving enforcement to help them do three things. First, we help them vet and build specialized anti-trafficking units. Just like we have specialized homicide units or units that focus on organized crime or on drugs, we help them create a specialized unit that focuses on human trafficking specifically. These are teams of police and prosecutors and victim specialists that focus on human trafficking, to specialize in that area of enforcement, and begin to push human trafficking cases through the criminal justice pipeline, from police to prosecution to courts. And we work with governments to help create fast-track mechanisms to make sure that these cases don't get stuck in a backlog of cases, but that we're actually efficiently processing these cases through the courts so that we can produce that little bit of enforcement that can produce big drops in the prevalence of trafficking. So once we help them build these specialized units, then we will put these units through a mini law enforcement academy. That is a very hands-on practical opportunity to apply these skills in a tailored human trafficking case that we build for them. So over a 1 to 2 week period, they engage in sort of this compressed casework where they work as a team to build a human trafficking case from the very beginning all the way to a mock trial at the end. And along the way, they'll have little labs where they'll get to practice specific skills. They'll practice how to interview victims, and we'll have role players that represent very real stories of how victims respond in interviews to help them learn how to engage effectively with victims in the interview process. We'll have a corroboration clinic where they'll learn how do you actually gather the corroborative evidence that you need to build effective cases against traffickers. And then they'll ultimately get to apply all those skills in a mock trial. And then the third component of our model is embedded experts. That is, we hire former law enforcement professionals, former prosecutors who have done these cases before, who move to that partner country and by agreement with the government, start officing with those units and working with them day in and day out on their cases, helping them build their skills, helping them move their cases forward, and helping create that transparency and accountability that helps protect against corruption risk. And then those embedded experts work with those teams over a period of years until we start to see self-sustaining enforcement capacity, until those teams can actually continue to increase enforcement on their own steam without the Institute's additional support. So we really launched our work globally in 2017. October 2017 was when we first had full-time Institute employees on the ground, and we started in 2 partner countries, Uganda in East Africa and in Belize in Central America. Let me share a little bit about our work in how our model works in Uganda. So in Uganda, we began, as I said, in October 2017, and we began to work with the government of Uganda on building a specialized human trafficking unit. Ultimately, Uganda agreed to not just create a specialized human trafficking unit, but to build an entire countrywide human trafficking department within its police force, staffed with 250 plus police and staff. This is very exciting. This is the kind of leveraged impact that our model can help generate when you see governments committing to that kind of investment in human trafficking enforcement. Uganda sent a cohort of police and prosecutors and victim specialists to the Global Human Trafficking Academy in 2018 to begin to develop some of those skills. And we now have embedded a highly experienced human trafficking prosecutor to lead our work in Uganda in partnership with the Ugandan government. So it's very exciting to see just in a short period of time since 2017, our model really taking shape in Uganda. We've also seen some very similar progress in moving our model forward in Belize. We began work in Belize, having our first full-time person in 2017. Through our work and in partnership with the Belizean government, Belize has now created a specialized police unit that's dedicated to working exclusively on human trafficking cases. Belize also sent a cohort of police and prosecutors and victim specialists to our Human Trafficking Academy in 2018. We worked with the judiciary in Belize, and they assigned a Supreme Court justice to specialize in human trafficking cases and help keep the docket of human trafficking cases moving forward. By agreement, we now have this specialized unit operating in a secure offsite location. And we have a law enforcement expert, which I'll tell you a little bit more about later, who by agreement offices with the specialized unit and works with them day in and day out on their cases. In 2019, Belize became the only country in the world to be elevated off the State Department sanctions list after being on it for 4 or more years. So it's been actually quite exciting to see this model beginning to be implemented in Uganda and in Belize. One of the most powerful things about this model, I think, is that there is a kind of leveraged impact that comes from it. There are multiplier effects that increase the impact of the model as we work these cases. One of the multiplier effects is that each of the members of the specialized unit, as they're trained and equipped with the skills that they need to be effective, is not just going to prosecute one trafficker, but is actually going to prosecute many traffickers over the course of his or her career. And most of these traffickers don't just exploit one victim, they exploit many victims. And therefore, every trafficker stopped represents not just one victim freed, but a group of victims freed. And then in addition, because trafficking is an ongoing offense and traffickers tend to continue to exploit more and more victims over time if there's no consequence for their actions, each trafficker stopped also represents a future stream of victims that no longer has to spend years of their life enduring this kind of trauma or struggling to recover from it. So our excitement is that we don't have to get all the traffickers, we can get a small portion of the traffickers, and then we can see a deterrent effect that begins to impact other traffickers who have never actually been prosecuted because the risk goes up. So that's a little bit of an overview of our model and how it works and how it's being implemented in Uganda and in Belize. And so I'm now going to invite Shannon to lead us through some Q&A on our 2020 annual report. Welcome, Shannon.
Hey, Victor, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Shannon Gage. I am the social media and digital marketing coordinator at the Human Trafficking Institute. And like Victor said, we're going to transition into a period of question and answer. So thank you guys so much to everybody who has joined us today to hear about our progress in 2020 towards our mission to decimate trafficking. If you have any questions while we're speaking, feel free to just drop them into the Q&A box and we will be asking audience questions soon. So to start, Victor, I just want to ask, it's been a year full of challenges with COVID, but it's also been a year full of successes. So I just want to hear for our audience today, what have been HTI's biggest successes in the past year?
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Shannon. I think, well, let me start with Uganda. I think Uganda has been a really special story this past year. A little bit before 2020 began, we hired Tyler Dunman, who's a very experienced, one of the most experienced human trafficking prosecutors I know. He led the human trafficking prosecution unit just outside Houston, Texas, has prosecuted a number of human trafficking cases. And he and his wife and their 3 girls at the end of 2019 quit their job, sold their home and their cars, and they moved to Kampala, Uganda, to lead our work there. This is all pre-COVID. He actually came to DC for a strategy session where we began to talk about our goals and our strategy for the upcoming year. And we put a pretty challenging target ahead of him. As we talked about our goals for the coming year, we talked about what would it look like to have a 70% increase in enforcement during the coming year. And we had a little bit of an internal debate of, is this actually a motivating stretch goal, or is this actually demoralizingly realistic or high? But we ultimately held the 70% goal. So Tyler and his family, Tyler goes back to Uganda and begins to implement our model there. And then, of course, in March, COVID hits in earnest, and everything gets much, much harder. So the borders are shut down, police are diverted to other priorities, and Tyler and his family, in discussion with us and looking at the different risk factors in our team, decided that they're going to stay in Uganda during the pandemic. And so at that time, we had a discussion about, what would it look like for us to actually, even though things just got a lot harder, hold that target at 70%. And Tyler is not one to shy away from a challenge, and he sort of seized the challenge by the horns and agreed to push forward and just bring forward his best ideas. In July, he proposed a new intervention, a new idea that honestly I didn't think much of at the time, but it turned out to be incredibly effective. He said, look, what I want to do is the dominant communication platform in Uganda is not email, it's text, and it's via WhatsApp. That's the dominant communication platform. And he said, I want to create a WhatsApp group with basically any police or prosecutor in Uganda who could possibly touch a human trafficking case. And I just want to send them just a law enforcement tip of the day. And I kind of thought, well, it kind of sounds like spam to me. I feel like I already get too many emails, but it's free. And so let's try it and see what happens. And so he began to do this, and what he found is that very quickly he started getting a number of different police and prosecutors pinging him back, saying, "Hey, yeah, I have a case. Kind of sounds like human trafficking. Not quite sure." And Tyler picks up the phone and calls them and says, "Hey, tell me about your case." And they start talking about it. And says, "Well, that is trafficking." So, "Well, I've never actually tried a human trafficking case before. I'm not quite sure how to do that." And they have that conversation. Ultimately, they work on the case together, get it charged. Well, this happens enough that Tyler comes back to me and says, "Hey, I think we need to create a charging manual, a very straightforward, almost like recipe style. Here's how you charge a human trafficking case. And then we need to get this out to prosecutors around the country." Well, obviously that's a challenge with COVID, but we got special permission from sort of the equivalent of the Attorney General in Uganda to not do a scale training, but to go district by district and train prosecutors in each district in Uganda. There's 16 of them, and Tyler just began to do them one at a time. Super low tech, no PowerPoint, just very concrete. Here's a key tool in your tool bag that you're not using a lot, and here's why it's such a powerful tool for you to use. Here's how it works, and essentially, here's my card. I'm your customer service guy. If you got any questions, you pick up my card, you call me, and I'll help you with it. And so that began in July, and we just started seeing skyrocketing numbers, really unprecedented increases that I had never really seen before. We saw cases and investigations jump up immediately. Between July and August, we saw the number of investigations increase by 126%. Charges went up by 135%, and arrests went up by 100%. By October, that had ballooned to a 1,200% increase in the number of traffickers arrested and a 1,300% increase in the number of victims protected. I mean, these are truly unprecedented numbers. I've never seen increases like that in the 20 plus years that I've been involved in this work. So ultimately, Tyler ended up training 252 prosecutors, 82 police officers, 21 judicial officials, and 137 community members and service providers. And I share those just to give you those numbers, but But from our perspective, we're not primarily a training organization. We're in the business of transformation. And so that training is not an end in itself. It's only useful if it results in significant change in the outcomes and actual cases moving forward. And so to see that the real story here, I think, is the increase in the number of traffickers stopped and the number of victims protected. And we've seen even new types of cases that I had never prosecuted before in my career as a human trafficking prosecutor. And I'll share just one example of that because I found it incredibly powerful and moving and illustrative of a number of cases that look like this in Uganda. So this case involves a small business owner in Uganda who wants his business to be more profitable. And so what does he do? Well, he goes, instead of getting maybe a business loan or finding a business mentor, he goes to the local witch doctor in his community who says, I can actually make your business more profitable, but in order to do that, I'm going to perform a sort of incantation that involves you bringing me the severed hand of a child. And so this business owner goes to the neighboring village, which is quite poor, and he sees a little boy, we'll call him Jacob, who's 3 years old. He's out playing in the field, and this business owner just takes him, essentially kidnaps Jacob and takes him back to the businessman's home, and he proceeds to sever his right hand and basically leave him to die. And he goes to the witch doctor, and remarkably, Jacob is able to cry out loud enough before he passes out that the neighbors hear, and they rush over. They, of course, see this 3-year-old boy who's a bloody mess, and they rush him to the hospital, and miraculously, he survived. Obviously, he lost his hand, but he survived, and he's now back with his family. Sadly, many of these stories do not end that way. They end up being homicide and trafficking cases under Uganda's laws. So Jacob was more fortunate than many who are victim to this form of child sacrifice. Well, we were very quickly, we were able to marshal the police. The Ugandan police went out and arrested this business owner who had committed this crime, this violation of Uganda's trafficking laws, and he was arrested, which is great. But what had never happened before, ever, in this district in Uganda, is to actually go after the witch doctor who's directing all these other businessmen to do the same thing. And so we began to talk about, well, what would it look like to go after the witch doctor? And of course, that's a scary proposition because witch doctors can be quite scary and intimidating and viewed as very powerful and high status. But that's what the rule of law means, that no one is above the law. Everyone is held accountable. So ultimately, we were able to work with the Ugandan police, and an arrest warrant was issued for this witch doctor who went on the run. And it was literally a witch hunt for a month. And ultimately he was found and he was arrested. And we've since had a number of other cases like that. And that has been really powerful because it has really sent a powerful message to witch doctors that it's no longer possible to treat, boys like Jacob no differently than the butcher treats a piece of meat. And it's communicated. They've made a powerful mistake in their calculations that these children are a lot more valuable than they realized, and it's beginning to shift the cultural expectation there. So I'm very encouraged by that. Now, that's a minority of our cases. The vast majority of our cases in Uganda are labor trafficking cases and sex trafficking cases, and we've seen just tremendous growth and impact in the work that's happened there. So that's been a huge encouragement in Uganda. In Belize, we've also seen some huge encouragement. This beginning of this year, we hired a law enforcement professional, very, very experienced law enforcement advisor who has 27 years of experience in law enforcement, former FBI agent, former California police lieutenant, just a tremendous amount of investigative experience to help lead our work in Belize. And he's begun to, he offices with the specialized police unit in Belize and works with them day in and day out on their cases, assisting them in their investigations. And we've already started to see impact from his presence on the ground. So in February, he assisted with an investigation that led to the arrest of 2 suspects who are charged with labor trafficking. One who's a 16-year-old survivor is now free. And we're starting to see, really for the first time, convictions under Belize's human trafficking law happening. I think prior to a March 2020 conviction, Belize had 1 conviction under its current anti-trafficking law that was in 2016. So we're starting to see these cases perk all the way through the system and start to produce convictions. And that begins to change the landscape for traffickers around the country. So really encouraged to see the progress that's happening in both Uganda and Belize during this past year.
Wow, thanks for sharing. That's really, really encouraging to hear those stories of, hope and just bringing survivors to justice, and those steps towards sustainable change. I know that we had many successes last year, but also there were a lot of difficulties. So can you share a little bit about some of the challenges that HTI faced?
I think surely the largest challenge is just the pandemic itself, which for HTI, just like for everyone else, just had a tremendous impact. And so we kind of stopped everything we're doing in March, and I brought the leadership team together and we talked about how we want to lead through this challenge. And we really talked about 3 core areas of leadership that we wanted to focus on. We wanted to focus on finances. How do we don't know if COVID is going to be, in a sense, a blizzard or a winter or like a mini ice age. We just don't know. And so how do we plan financially to survive and thrive in this context in the coming years? So we made some choices about budgeting and budgeting conservatively and making sure that our finances were in good shape. And we had a number of key friends and supporters, including some on this call, who justice partners who really showed up and helped us carry through financially. And then we focused on our team. How do we take care of our team? There's just a very practical set of new challenges that team members are facing, and they're very different depending on the team member and where they are and what their family situation is. And so how do we support our team during the season? And then the third bucket was strategic advances. And what we realized is traffickers aren't going to sit COVID on the sidelines. They don't get a PPP loan to help them sort of through the challenge. They only make money when they're exploiting people. And for them, this is basic economics. So for them, they actually see this surge in the sea of vulnerable victims available to them to exploit. And then they see, and they've watched for many years as, say, purchasers of commercial sex or end users will be a predictable and undeterrable supply. So they knew they'd have plenty of supply. And now you have law enforcement diverted to other priorities, so your risk just went down. So you have ample supply, resilient demand, less risk. That's just a recipe for open season on the poor. And so we began to look at, actually, among other things, our federal human trafficking report, which you'll hear a little bit more later. This has become really, I think, the most authoritative data on US federal human trafficking cases in the world. And we have spent a lot of time and resources really mining those cases. And by the end of the year, we'll have mapped all 20 years of cases under the existing federal human trafficking statute, which is the dominant statute used by federal prosecutors in this country, and try to identify key trends. And so we started to look at, well, how do traffickers respond, say, in venue-based models, that is, models that are based around a physical location, like a cantina or a brothel or something like that, when there's increased enforcement. And one of the inferences that you could draw from the data here in the US is that as you begin to increase enforcement on those venue-based models, it actually accelerates a shift to online-based models. And so we saw just tremendous increases in the number of cases here in the US that had internet facilitated models of sex trafficking. Between 2005 and 2018, we went from about, I think, 12% to about 91% of the cases using an internet facilitated model. And so one of the things we use that to do is to sort of predict what would happen here in Uganda when you have increased enforcement on physical locations, and our hypothesis was we'll see the same thing. We'll see actually a surge in internet facilitated trafficking, and that ended up proving very true. We started seeing these sex parties in Uganda that were actually featured through online venues, and worked directly with our counterparts in Uganda, and had a number of significant arrests that resulted in a large number of traffickers arrested and a number of victims protected through that process. So it was exciting to see the power of the Federal Human Trafficking Report harnessed even in our country projects work in Uganda. So that was super encouraging.
Yeah, that is really encouraging. And speaking of, things that we've accomplished in the US, can you share a little bit more about what we've accomplished through influencing policy or the Douglas Fellows program?
Yeah, I love the Douglas Fellows program. It's one of my favorite things that we do. For those of you who are unfamiliar with it, we're now in our 4th year of the Douglas Fellowship, and it is a fellowship designed for really some of the top law students in the country who are passionate about human trafficking. And we have just been stunned by the incredible quality of applicants that we have received, and have been able to put together these truly outstanding classes of future leaders in this space. And so we had our 4th class of Douglas Fellows who hailed from Harvard Law School and Michigan and the USC and William and Mary, and they are truly impressive. And they basically do 3 things. They help with key research and data that is going to help drive, I think, progress in this work. They get mentorship from a senior leader in the human trafficking space outside the Institute. And then they also put together an event on their campus to help raise awareness about human trafficking and continue the conversation there. And this year, we even had one of our fellows publish a piece of scholarship in conjunction with another HTI team member to help drive the data and the scholarship that we think is actually so important in making this possible. And what we recognize is that the Institute is one component of the fight, and that actually over time, what ends up changing things in social movements is actually a diverse network of influencers in a variety of different capacities who all have a shared goal. And so our hope is that in a number of years, we'll have really just a network of Douglas Fellows who are in positions of great influence in law and government and policy and philanthropy and finance, in politics, that are actually all helping drive progress in measurably decimating trafficking around the globe. So very excited about that. In addition, we also have a focus on influencing the US government to advance enforcement here in the US. And so we were able to actually successfully influence Congress to provide more funding for specialized anti-trafficking prosecutors. So I'm very excited about that. These colleagues, they're my colleagues, they're Lindsay's colleagues. They work incredibly hard, they're incredibly skilled. And this means that the US government will be able to provide more resources for that specialized prosecution effort that results in significant increases in enforcement. So very excited to see that as well. And then finally, as I mentioned, the Federal Human Trafficking Report, we had our Federal Human Trafficking Report downloaded over 2,000 times. We were able to share it with over 200 officials in 5 different US agencies, as well as US attorneys' offices around the country. And the next report will analyze all 20 years of data. And I think it's really going to become an essential tool for policymakers and government agencies to improve anti-trafficking efforts. So incredibly proud of our team in producing another outstanding Federal Human Trafficking Report.
That's so awesome. And I'm really excited for the release, which is coming up soon. So if you guys are following us already, go ahead and follow us at Trafficking INST on social media and keep an eye out for that report. We're going to be releasing some promos for it soon. And okay, now I'm going to start asking questions that were asked by the audience. So if you have any questions, go ahead and drop them in the Q&A box. And the first question I have for you, Victor, is from Christopher. It's, what trends do you think there will be regarding human trafficking in the post-COVID era?
So I do think that as I alluded to earlier, one of the trends that we will see is that as these physical locations, as venues are shut down, traffickers will, I think when we first, entered into the pandemic, I heard some sort of speculating, well, maybe one silver lining of this very dark pandemic is that there will be less trafficking because the venues, the places, the brothels, the restaurants where this is taking place are shut down. So if that's where it's taking place and it's shut down, there'll be less trafficking. And so maybe that's a silver lining. And I think we were a little skeptical about that because our thesis based on the data that we were looking at was actually, we think that's actually going to serve as an accelerant that will catalyze the shift and toward internet facilitated sex trafficking. And that is the trend that we're seeing around not just in Uganda, but really around the globe. The number of cyber tips and around human trafficking has grown by leaps and bounds during COVID. And so we think that is one of the key trends that will happen. And I think that would have likely happened anyway with increased enforcement. As you increase enforcement, you'll see that. And I think this may have just accelerated that transition to internet facilitated sex trafficking. So I think that's one of the key trends in the post-COVID era that we are seeing. And then I think that just the other reality is just that the surge in the sea of vulnerable victims, that I think traffickers have more vulnerable potential victims to exploit than ever before because of the economic impact of COVID. And so from their perspective, the supply of available victims has grown significantly, and I don't think they've seen any meaningful reduction in demand. And so the key will be, can we actually marshal law enforcement to increase the risk associated with that crime or not? And if we can, I think we'll see trafficking go down. If we can't, I think we'll see it go up.
Thanks for that. Okay, I have another question about our work in Uganda. It's from Norman. Norman wants to know, what kind of legal system do they have in Uganda? And related to that, what do your trainings of prosecutors entail?
I'm sorry, I missed the second part of the question. Can you repeat that, Shannon?
Oh, sorry. I said, what do your trainings of prosecutors in Uganda entail?
Okay, got it. So first, what kind of legal system exists in Uganda? Uganda basically is a former British colony, and so they have what's called a common law system, which is the same kind of system that we have here in the US, which means that the law is developed through judicial decisions, which are called case law, and that the law is sort of sharpened and clarified through those judicial decisions that happen over time. So it's actually quite a similar system to the system that we have here in the US. It's also true of Belize. And that is sort of actually even a plus factor that we think about as we are examining potential partner countries, is the familiarity of that common law system that exists, and that the lingua franca, the language that's used in the courts, is English in both Uganda and in Belize. And so that's the nature of the legal system. The nature of the trainings, I would say there's really two different styles of training. There are types of training that we do. One is sort of identification trainings, and this is not necessarily for those who are going to be involved in prosecuting human trafficking on a day-to-day basis. It's sort of like in the Navy, you have the SEALs that get specialized training to do special missions, but you really don't need everybody in the Navy to be a SEAL. Likewise, you don't need every law enforcement in the country to become a human trafficking specialist, but you do need actually a team of specialists that can help drive those cases forward. So the goal of the identification trainings is to do large-scale trainings where you're helping people identify trafficking when they see it, so that their eyes are attuned to it, they can recognize it, and the goal is that as they recognize it, then they can refer it to the specialized unit to actually work the case. And so one category of training that we do are these identification trainings. The other category of training we do is focused on those who will actually be prosecuting those cases or moving those cases forward. And that's a lot more in-depth training on everything from case identification to how do you do victim interviews, to how do you gather the corroboration that you need to show that the that the victim's testimony is corroborated by extrinsic sources, by other sources other than just their testimony. And then how do you prepare for trial issues? What are the evidentiary issues that you might face at trial? And so it's a much, much more in-depth training. And then all that training with the specialized police and prosecutors that are working these cases is supplemented by our embedded experts who actually help them work this out on a day-to-day basis. So the analogy in my mind is it's a little bit like my parents were physicians and they went through medical school and acquired some core knowledge, but then they had this whole period of residency where all they're doing basically is working with the senior surgeon day in and day out with their patients until they're able to do this on their own. And so honestly, that's just kind of how we build specialized skills in any category that matters to us. It's sort of acquiring the core knowledge we need, but you're actually not good at something until typically you work for an extended period of time with someone who's done it before, who can help you build your skills and solve complications that come up and until you're able to do it on your own. And I think that is the key. I just have found that short-term trainings that don't include that sort of residency piece, they end up not making a tremendous impact on the number of cases out there. And so we think that's a critical component of actually seeing transformational change take place in our partner countries.
Yeah, that's really important. And on a related note, Tracy asked, once victims are identified, what services are available for survivors?
A great question. And so one of the things that is critically important is building those partnerships with service providers in the communities where we serve. And so we actually spend a lot of time building those relationships of trust with service providers and helping law enforcement understand that this is not extra credit. This is actually an essential part of, one, caring for the victims, and two, actually building effective cases, that you actually can't do it without partnering with effective service providers who can provide the care for the victims they need, who can assess those needs, and who can help prepare those who choose to testify for that experience. And so that's just a critical component. So we sort of map the service providers in the area. We have in Uganda a full-time person that's their sole job is to help map the service providers and help match them with survivors who need that care. And that's just a critical component of the work that we do. And ultimately, you need to have someone really inside the law enforcement team, which is often called a victim witness coordinator, who is helping not provide the care, but quarterback the care for those survivors to make sure that it happens in a timely fashion and that it is all set up for care so that victims can be cared for right away.
Thanks for that. Yeah, it's super important to center survivors and prioritize their well-being and care. So I appreciate that answer. So I think right now we can transition out of our Q&A portion. Thank you to everybody who asked questions from the audience. And I'll let you introduce our next guest speaker, Victor. Thank you.
Well, I am thrilled to get to introduce Lindsay Robertson. Lindsay is a tremendously gifted lawyer and prosecutor and colleague and friend. She's operated at the highest level in the private sector. She has been a state prosecutor in North Carolina. She has been a superstar prosecutor at the Federal Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit, which is my colleagues at the Justice Department. And we are incredibly honored to have her on the team, helping lead our thought leadership work and our prosecution work globally. She is really a dynamic and powerful leader in this space. And so I'm thrilled to get to invite her to come provide a sort of sneak peek of the Federal Human Trafficking Report for this year. Lindsay?
Thanks, Victor. And thanks, Shannon, so much for helping coordinate this, and to our advancement team and to all the participants today that are taking time out of your day to learn a bit more about our work and what our progress has looked like in 2020. And I am really excited to take just a few minutes and share with you about our upcoming publication for this year's Federal Human Trafficking Report. So this is our 4th year in publication, which in and of itself is a feat. And I am so honored really to be the senior legal counsel at the Institute who gets the privilege of working with the stellar legal staff here who make this enormous publication, exhaustive publication possible. So I just want to share a little bit with you about that. And I'll do that by way of background, sort of, as Victor mentioned, I am a career prosecutor before I came to the Institute, both at the state level and the federal level. And before I began working at the Institute, I learned of the Federal Human Trafficking Report and used it as a practitioner to guide my work. There's nothing else like it. That's the one thing I want you to remember about the Federal Human Trafficking Report. There is no other publication that is seeking to accomplish the goals that the report accomplishes, and really no other publication that has the bandwidth and the impact that this publication has in the federal space. So, as I said, this is our 4th year of publication, and this year is really exciting because we are celebrating the 20-year anniversary of the Trafficking Victim Protection Act, which is our federal legislation that criminalizes trafficking in the US. And so we have now 20 years of data, of federal enforcement data across the country and the nation. And that, as you might imagine, has been an enormous undertaking for our team and our staff. The Federal Human Trafficking Report, which I think we'll put a link to last year's report in the chat so you can take a look at it, really has always been comprehensive, but this is the first year that we've been able to include 20 years of data and analyze 20 years of trends of enforcement in the United States. And so what is the report, and why do we publish this? Why do we go to such great lengths to make this available to the public and other criminal justice practitioners? And as I mentioned, that's because there's nothing else like it in this space. You might be surprised to learn there's no government agency that is providing this information or collecting this data and providing it to the public in a way that, in any way, but certainly not in the comprehensive way that we do. It also aligns with the Institute's values. As Victor was saying, we really want to take an objective look at what's happening in the enforcement arena of human trafficking, and we want our practices and policies to be guided by what's happening and also what's not happening. What types of enforcement are not occurring. And so we look at this data, we objectively present it in our publication. It has no persuasive value other than to simply show the public and criminal justice practitioners what is happening in the space of federal human trafficking enforcement. And so what we do is we look at every single federal human trafficking case in the United States. And we have a team of accomplished attorneys who read every single case, every single press release. They reach out to the agencies to cross-check and confirm and make sure that our data is accurate and complete. And then we go to our stakeholders in the federal government, our partners in the practitioner field, prosecutors, law enforcement, and equally important, we go to survivors and we ask for their input on the report to make sure that it is comprehensive and that we're looking at it from as many prismatic angles as we can to make sure that we are approaching this problem and presenting the data in the most comprehensive nature possible. So, and then finally, sort of who do we do this for? We do this for our criminal justice practitioner partners, because as I mentioned, like myself and like Victor, when we were in the field, there was nothing like this to look to see what types of trafficking are being prosecuted in the United States. What are the trends? What are the types of victims that are being, handled in these cases or identified in these cases? How are they being identified? What are previous vulnerabilities that they experienced before they were targeted by a trafficker? The report includes data on all of those topics. And previously there was nowhere to look for that in terms of enforcement specific data. So I want to give you just a couple of tidbits, a little bit of a sneak peek into this year's 2020 report, which we will publish in June of this year. We're really excited about that. We'll have another live event where we can really dive into the data and be sort of nerdy about it. But I just want to give you a couple of bullets, high level points that you will see in this year's report. So as I mentioned, we've had 20 years of the Trafficking Victim and Protection Act enforcement in the US. And in those 20 years, there have been over 2,000 criminal federal human trafficking cases charged. And so that might be surprising to you in terms of maybe it's not as many as you thought, or maybe it's more than you thought, but there's 2,000 cases right now in our database. And in that database, we look through, as I mentioned, a number of separate data points and data sets. We look at the victim vulnerabilities, and we can look at the objective facts from these cases and say that most victims in cases being prosecuted in the US today, they're not people who are being, snatched by strangers or kidnapped in shopping malls. These are people who have pre-existing vulnerabilities that traffickers specifically target. So for example, in this year's data, we're looking at prior exploitation or prior vulnerabilities, including 38% of the victims had a prior substance abuse dependency problem. 28% of them were runaways before they encountered their trafficker. 10% of them suffered from a period of homelessness before they encountered exploitation. So there are a lot of different vulnerabilities that lead victims to become vulnerable to exploitation and trafficking, including prior trafficking. 8% of victims had been trafficked in the past before they were trafficked in their current case. So we're able to look at a number of trends, including how the victims met their traffickers. We see a tremendous amount of victims that are encountering their traffickers online. And while it's too early for us to really be able to analyze or look at the impact of COVID, one of the trends we'll definitely be digging into in years to come is what is the effect of this pandemic and lockdown and everybody working online, including school children doing their schooling online? What is the impact of that been on trafficking and online exploitation? So the report gives us just a prolific amount of data to go through and to really then be able to pull out and see trends over time. So one trend, for example, I'll just point out to you is that in this year alone, the United States prosecuted more sex trafficking cases than we prosecuted forced labor cases in all 20 years following the enactment of the TVPA. So we can look at those numbers, and more importantly, practitioners can look at those numbers and ask themselves, what more could we be doing to confront forced labor in this country? And so those are the sorts of questions, the meaningful conversations that our report allows both practitioners and policymakers to engage in. And then we at the Institute engage with them as well. So it's a really incredibly meaningful process for us to be a part of at the Institute and also to share with you. And none of this would be possible without the help of our donors and our partners in the field that are consistently generous with their time and their resources. So we could not thank you enough. And we look forward to sharing this year's report with you.
Thank you, Lindsay. Well, as we draw our time together to a close, I do hope that this hour that we spent together has been a really deep encouragement to you. I hope you found very tangible points of hope, whether it's in the tremendous increase in the number of cases in Uganda, or whether it's seeing Belize have a new law enforcement advisor that's driving new convictions in Belize, or whether it's the federal human trafficking report and how that's being harnessed to actually increase enforcement and help us better understand how traffickers respond to increased enforcement, or the rise of the growth of the Douglas Fellows, these incredible future leaders in this space who will help shape and influence what's happening, or the congressional work that's helping drive policy changes that increase the amount of funding that go to specialized prosecution here in the US to continue the good work that's being done out of the Justice Department and with companion federal investigative agencies. So for me, I have just found that in sort of a dark cloud of a year, this has just been a ray of light piercing through the darkness and bringing very tangible hope to the victims and now survivors that we serve. And on behalf of the team, we really just want to thank you for making 2020 a year of truly unprecedented impact for us. It really is hard for me to believe that, we just didn't even have a presence on the ground in Uganda or Belize until 2017. And now we're seeing these transformational changes happen in a remarkably fast time. In the scope of history, the kind of transformational change that we're seeking often takes a decade or more, which is just a flash in the pan. When you think about the following decades where there's enduring and sustainable protection that prevents people from ever having to be exploited in the first place. And we know that, as I shared at the beginning, that this has been a challenging year for many nonprofits. We know that many struggled to survive and didn't. And thanks to our supporters, we were able to not just survive, but really to thrive and see incredible growth. And we are on a very aggressive growth curve. I think one of the rays of light is seeing not just a 70% increase in enforcement that seemed like a stretch goal at the beginning of the year in Uganda, but seeing within a span of a few months 1,100% increases in enforcement or 1,300% increases in enforcement. That is certainly something to be celebrated. And it also means there's just a lot more cases coming down the pipeline. And we certainly want to be mindful of the incredible leaders that are helping lead our work there. We don't want them to be burned out or overworked. We want to actually now, we feel like this is not the time to sort of hit the brakes, but it's actually the time to mash the pedal to the ground and continue to build on the momentum that's snowballing in Uganda and Belize to help stop traffickers and protect more victims. And so we have set some another set of very aggressive goals for the coming fiscal year. And to accomplish those goals, we'll need to continue our growth curve. And I'm just so thankful for the friends and partners who've been a part of making that possible. And we just want to invite you to continue. And we often get asked, we love what's happening at HTI. How do we get involved? What can we actually do? What's something that we can tangibly do? What if we're not a specialized human trafficking prosecutor like Lindsay, or what if we're not, the former head of the State Department's human trafficking investigations unit, like John Freeman, who leads our law enforcement work, or the former head of Homeland Security's victim services team, like Marie Martinez-Israelite, who leads our victim services work. What if we don't have that kind of experience? What can we actually do tangibly to advance and get involved with the work of HTI? And so I want to just give one very concrete thing that I think literally every single person on the call can do that's actually pretty easy and is a very tangible thing that actually helps us. And that is I'd love for you to consider becoming a justice partner. I know that some of you already give to HTI, and we would love for you to just become a monthly donor to help sustain our work. One of the weird things about nonprofits is that you build this plan, you build this budget, and it's hard to know where that revenue is going to come from to fund that. And so the more that we have sustainable sources of funding, the easier it is for us to say to really talented people like Tyler Dunman, who's leading our work in Uganda, or the specialized law enforcement advisor in Belize, hey, there's already a group of people who are committed to helping provide the funding necessary to get you and your family to be able to lead this work in a sustainable way. So our goal for today is just 20 new justice partners. And so we invite you to become one of that. I'd love to see that goal sort of blown out of the water. I don't care, it doesn't matter at what level, but it is a way to become a monthly partner to have sort of a discipline of engaging with this fight every month, having that tangibly come before you every month in a way that can direct resources to help increase the capacity of HTI to stop more traffickers and protect more victims. So we also invite you to follow us on social media to get updates from our team and the work that's happening there. But as we come on the top of the hour, I just want to thank you once again for your time today. We are so honored to get to partner in this work with you, and it simply would not be possible to share this good news without each of you. So thank you for joining us today, and I hope you have a great rest of the day. Thanks.